I just want to thank all the people who made this possible. I want to thank our provost for his support, as well as Chris and Corey for organizing this event, as well as Maureen for her advertising of the event. And with that, I will introduce our wonderful speaker and my wonderful colleague, Woody. Woody is a professor at the law school and the class 1960 scholar. His work on privacy law and technology has been internationally recognized and influential, and I'm so excited for his talk, which is titled "The Case Against Normalizing Surveillance." So, Woody, please take it away.
Thanks to the entire faculty at CDS for having me. Particularly thanks to Professor Okedegbe and McDonald for inviting us for this, I think, critically important lecture series. I will put a plug in for the remaining speakers of this lecture series, who are my favorite scholars of all time, including Pat Williams, Karen Levy, and Vina Dubal. You do not want to miss this, and so it's an honor for me to be up here and to be able to talk about this. I'm delighted to give this talk because my research focuses on how technology and data allocate power and how it is used and abused. And my talk tonight particularly is about surveillance and how there is particular reason to be concerned about the uneven and disparate way that power is taken from and used against vulnerable communities along lines of race, gender, sexual identity, ability, and class. My research tonight is based on my talk tonight is based on research that I have engaged in with two co-authors. One is my longtime writing partner, Evan Selinger, who is a philosophy professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he and I have written extensively about surveillance, as well as the amazing Joanna Gunawan, who wanted to be here tonight and sends apologies. She's finishing up her PhD at Northeastern, but was not feeling well tonight and couldn't come. Okay, so the case against normalizing surveillance. I would like to tell you a story about the trajectory of privacy. So not long ago, CCTV was viewed as the death of privacy. If you Google it, you'll see tons of articles saying exactly that. And now these cameras can be seen on any random street corner, building, or classroom. In fact, we're long past the point of finding the combination of doorbells, cameras, and apps even strange. People even rarely use the phrase Internet of Things anymore, even though it was popular only even 5 years ago. It was a common way to talk about smart devices and doorbells. Now we accept that there's nothing remarkable about all kinds of mundane things being connected to the internet. They're just things. And Amazon does a pretty good job of marketing the idea that Ring is the ideal way to keep you and your property safe. That we're in control about how this technology is used. Now, when a lot of us see these cameras, most of us probably don't stop and think about how their widespread use is radically changing our surveillance infrastructure, the experience of public space, and attitudes towards surveillance. We don't go, you know, there are 126 million Amazon Prime subscribers. What if they all installed Ring cameras and used the Neighbors app to monitor and report suspicious people? How would all this surveillance affect people's ability, particularly people of color, to exercise their right of free association? And how might it affect the power dynamics between citizens and police, especially since the technology makes it easier for law enforcement to gain access to a massive amount of surveillance footage? We probably don't stop and think all of that every single time we see a Ring doorbell camera. Maybe we say, oh, hey, a Ring doorbell camera. I might be on someone's screen. If we even think that. I have to admit, even myself, I have encountered this doorbell significantly enough that it doesn't trigger the same sort of response that it used to the first, second, or even 50th time I saw it. It's just a way, I think, that people think about ways to track their packages and see who's at their door. All right, show of hands time. We're going to do a little bit of participation. How many of you have had your face scanned at the airport recently? A few? Yep. more than there used to be, probably even 3 to 5 years ago. Not long ago, we just needed paper identification, a driver's license, or a passport, but facial recognition technology is becoming increasingly common at airports. Does it feel weird to have your face analyzed, of those of you that have experienced it? Maybe it did the first time, but I promise you that's going to change. Over time, you will just become routinized to having your face scanned so that you can get onto the airport as this becomes more common. Now, you can imagine how this is going to change our attitudes towards facial recognition in other areas, right? So if we become completely routinized to the fact that our face is scanned for access to, flights, maybe it gets more common. I don't know, you might imagine it showing up in the Amazon Ring, right? We might say, you could imagine a Ring commercial that would say something along the lines of, now with greater AI power, Ring not only knows who is near your home, but it can detect who is behaving suspiciously. To save you precious time, we can even call the police for you, right? That is something that is not that far away, certainly in terms of capability, and all we need is to become accustomed to the idea. In the future, cameras might analyze our faces and speech, classify us as safe or suspicious, maybe depending upon how we walk, how angry we look, or whether we say a particular set of words, and pass this judgment on. It might seem shocking to think about that now, but I promise you, as it happens more, we will become accustomed to it. So what about fitness trackers? How many people here have fitness trackers? A number of us, right? It's a very common thing. Fitness trackers started out as basically fancy pedometers, but it's not going to be that long until our mainstream fitness trackers infer our moods throughout the day based on biometric and mobility information. When this happens, you can count on AI assistants offering us advice on how to better manage stress. Maybe the algorithms will even advise us to avoid certain people because interacting with them makes our stress levels rise. If this feels strange at first, don't worry, we'll get used to it over time. My point here is this. Every single day, we face countless privacy violations, and we have come to see them as totally normal. The pattern that I'm describing is surveillance creep. It's pervasive across digital devices and surveillance practices. There are many different ways of thinking about it. The way that Evan and Joanna and I think about it borrows the definition from Neil Richards that thinks about privacy as the degree to which human information is neither known nor used, right? The degree of exposure represents a certain value related to privacy. And as soon as cameras monitor and sensors scan you, regardless of the rules that govern how the information should be used, according to this definition, our privacy tends to decrease a little because we are exposed more. To be clear, some of this is okay. Some of this is even desirable, and we want this to happen. This is the way in which society functions. We exchange information. But my point is that there are elements that we might want to think a little more critically about, even if they don't seem relatively significant. So I want to make the case today against the normalization of surveillance. To do that, I'd like to focus on the entity that should be doing something about it. And that is the group of legislators, regulators, and judges that help form what we refer to as the law. So today, to that end, I'd like to make one simple point. The law is not just permitting rampant surveillance, it is encouraging it by ignoring all of the de minimis ways in which we are forced to sacrifice our privacy or choose to sacrifice our privacy every single day. And this leads us, Evan and Joanna and I, to put forth what we call a privacy nix theory of how the law normalizes surveillance. Another way to think about this is the law looks to people's norms and expectations to set thresholds as to what counts as a privacy violation. And so what happens is when we become normalized to all of these sorts of small encroachments, the legal and social threshold for rejecting invasive new practices changes. excusing ever more aggressive intrusions. In effect, the test of what privacy law allows is whatever people will tolerate. We are on track to tolerate everything. Now, in theory, the law would prevent this. There are certain theories out there that the way in which we interact with technology is all about equilibrium adjustment. We get certain kinds of encroachments on one end, right? So someone introduces an invasive new technology, and the law responds and says, whoa, you've gone too far, right? That we have to set the equilibrium by, for example, many of you may be familiar with the US Supreme Court's Carpenter opinion where they said, you know what, we've thought about it, and cell site location information is just a little too invasive. And so whenever tech companies sort of get far ahead, the idea is that the law will sort of reset that equilibrium so that we can live in a safe and sustainable society. But the problem is that that's not happening right now. The law isn't adjusting to changing technologies and social practices by preserving or reestablishing privacy levels. Instead, even our most robust privacy rules are increasing our exposure. Privacy law has actually never been stronger, yet we've never been watched more. And we think that this is because the law ignores not the big things. Maybe it does an okay job at finding the big privacy encroachments, but it ignores the little things, what we call privacy nicks. And we call it privacy nicks. We were trying to think about the right metaphor to think about what these small little de minimis encroachments are. And we started using the metaphor death by 1,000 cuts, right? And that's where privacy nicks come from. Privacy nicks are small little encroachments. Sort of like when you're shaving and you get that small little nick, right? And you're like, oh, wow, it's not harmful, but it is something that maybe I noticed and you learn to ignore over time. And they're caused by the deployment of new information technologies that generally seem tolerable, but can lead to perilous long-term and individual consequences. An example would be new data analysis techniques, such as the use of facial recognition on Snapchat or voice recognition technologies or deployment of new sensors or increasingly aggressive requests for information. We introduced the theory of privacy nicks to think about the shortcomings of surveillance law and add precision to an issue that many of us understand intuitively but lack the language to really talk about. Right? Instead, what often happens is when we're confronted with a new technology, what's one of the most popular ways in which we respond? So the first time, try to think back to the first time you saw maybe the Ring camera, right? You go up to someone's door and you're like, oh wow, this is new, I'm now got a camera in front of me. Or you go to board a plane and you get a scan of your face and they're like, I remember the first time I went to Logan and I walked up and I was like, here's my boarding pass. They're like, we don't need it anymore. I was like, you don't need my boarding pass anymore? They're like, nah, we're doing facial recognition now. We just need the ID and we're going to scan it and we have all the information on the back end. What was your first reaction anytime you encountered that? What might you be feeling? Audience participation time. Creepy. Exactly. We get this sort of creepy, it's like, oh, that's kind of creepy. I don't like it, right? Creepy is helpful because it helps us identify when we sort of feel slightly unnerved by it, but it doesn't do much for us, right? Because that which was creepy even 5 years ago becomes normalized over time. And so we introduced the theory of privacy nicks as a way of talking about smaller encroachments and the way in which it's best to understand privacy nicks, those that present a sort of reasonably low or negligible risk of harm. That which we sort of excuse away as creepy. We don't like it, but it's like, well, my identity's not stolen. I don't feel like I've been really truly spied upon, so it's probably fine. We compare that to the privacy chop, right? Nicks and chops. This is sort of our theory. To better understand nicks, you really need something to compare it to, and these are the significant privacy violations. Privacy chops are actions or deployments of technology that increase the extent to which human information is known or used, enough to present a significant, immediate, and unreasonable risk of harm. Privacy chops are the things that the law is pretty good at stamping out, right? It finds the thing. If someone is spying on someone, so a digital peeping Tom, for example, would be the kind of thing that we would say, well, that's invasive, right? It's gone too far. It's immediately harmful. You've revealed incredibly harmful information about my health, that is now used to commit health fraud, among other things. And so these things are the opposite of NICs. They are quick, they are strong, and they have noticeable consequences. The reason that it's important to distinguish between NICs and CHOPs is that CHOPs garner legal responses. They also foment meaningful resistance, right? So people, for a certain amount of time, when they feel the CHOP, they say, I got to push back against that. I want to vote against that. I want to file a lawsuit against that because it violates my reasonable expectation of privacy. And so it actually allows us an opportunity to democratically sort of contemplate what the consequences of it are and then push back on it. But the reason that privacy NICs are so insidious is that they don't happen all at once. They happen just a little bit over time, right, in the long run. And we don't think about them every day. Maybe 2 or 3 years go by, and you say, oh yeah, rings are a thing now, right? I forgot about Amazon Ring, but that's all over the place. And so at that point, perhaps they've been widely deployed, and that's when we become accustomed to them. The other thing about NICs and CHOPs that's important to understand is that they are distributed unevenly, typically, though not exclusively, along lines of racial, gender, sexual identity, and ability lines. In other words, one person's NIC might be another person's CHOP, either directly or indirectly, depending on their identities and how they are situated. To the populace, individual NICs may seem like only minor deviations from the norm, and they might not even be perceived as risky or adversarial to your own personal interests. Those privileged enough to perceive privacy exposures as NICs or not at all might value the benefits of a particular technological deployment, say a health tracker or a Fitbit, over any perceived privacy trade-offs. This gets to what one of my favorite surveillance scholars, Chris Gilliard, has written about with luxury surveillance. It's not that we are being spied upon by force sometimes. Sometimes we have the luxury of affording it. We can choose to be surveilled and to surveil ourselves because we like what we get out of it, right? It's advantageous. I like the benefits of the Amazon Ring or the trackers. But that's because they're sort of considered a luxury, that we're positioned in a place to make those decisions. A really good example, my own example, would be the use of facial recognition to monitor kids at summer camp, which has become a pretty common thing to do, right? You want to see your kids running around. It's very nice, it's very helpful. We're not thinking about the fact that by normalizing these systems, then we're normalizing a sense of surveillance that can be used in other settings that are incredibly harmful to people, to over-police communities of color that now have a highly efficient tool of surveillance. And we just don't think about that, right? Because we're sort of thinking about our own benefits and to the technology and our own potential risks, which may be different than other people. And so in the paper, Evan and I get into a little bit about how to tell the difference between NICs and CHOPs. We start thinking about 4 major factors. And so maybe at this point, if you want to sort of shorthand to think about how do I tell what is a NIC and what's a CHOP? Well, the first thing we focus on, and this is just a shorthand framework. This is not like variables that we want to put into any sort of mathematical precision. But the first one is the extent to which encroachments reduce the transaction cost of surveillance. This is something that is sort of intuitively known, but we don't talk about surveillance in terms of transaction costs economics, but this is really the advantage of a lot of surveillance tools. What does design do? Design does 2 different things. It makes things easier, or it makes things harder. And it also sends signals, which we can talk about that. Surveillance tools, good ones, make things easier. They make watching people easier. It reduces the cost of labor. It makes things searchable. It allows you to store things in datafied form that otherwise would only exist in your mind. And so the more it reduces the transaction cost, the more likely it is to be a CHOP. And these are sort of, we look at things individually and then we look at them collectively. To what degree does a deployment challenge privacy existing norms? Well, if it's seen as a shock to us, if we reject it immediately, it's more likely going to be a chop. If it's the kind of thing where we get the creepy vibe from it, but it doesn't, we sort of collectively decide we can deal with it, then it's more likely to be a nick. Another factor that we wanted to make sure we included is, to what degree does the deployment of any particular technology empower the watchers? How are they now more powerful than they used to be, and how are people made more vulnerable? The more power that is conveyed, the more likely something is to be a chop, the less likely, the more likely it is to be a nick. And then finally, how many people stand to be affected by a deployment? So things that are highly localized are more likely to be a nick, right? It's just a little deployment here, it's just a little deployment there. We're rolling out facial recognition one airport at a time, right? Not all across the world. Did anyone read the story about the Wendy's that was deploying voice recognition technologies, and it was analyzing everyone's voice patterns, and they just did it one Wendy's at a time, so we're not going to roll it out broadly. That's more like a nick rather than a chop when you turn the switch and immediately facial recognition is on for every Amazon ring overnight. All right, so there are 3 points that I'd like to make about the law's involvement in privacy nicks here. The first is that the law is simply not designed to account for privacy nicks because it is focused on harm, waiver, and proximity. And I'll talk about what I mean by that. 2, left unchecked, privacy nicks distort and bypass our critical reflection capabilities and perpetually erode our expectations of privacy, which throws us into a disempowerment death spiral. Reasonable expectations of privacy are kind of the whole game in privacy law, and so if there's something that diminishes that, then that's bad times for us. Finally, the best way for lawmakers to confront privacy nicks and prevent the normalization of surveillance is by focusing on the social good, collective good, targeting design and implementing outright bans on practices and tools. I'll unpack all 3 of those points in turn. First, let's talk about how the law is simply not designed to address these small privacy nicks. The first way is with a focus on harms. The law primarily, if someone complains to it, will say, all right, well, how is this bad? Tell me how you've been injured. If you have been injured, then we'll talk about how to remedy it. This is, first of all, manifest within the concept of standing requirements. That you have to prove some sort of concrete injury before you can bring a case in front of a court. The problem with standing requirements is that not everybody is immediately able to be affected, right? And so we have all these problems around demonstrating what constitutes a specifically felt concrete injury. This also is the case for damages and prima facie elements within torture injury thresholds for unfairness complaints, all of which more or less boils down to the fact that if you find information, some sort of practice or some sort of tool creepy, that's not enough. They need to have some kind of extreme emotional injury. Can you prove that you perhaps lost money on this? Can you show me that you were denied some sort of significant life opportunity because of this? The problem with privacy nicks is that it almost never meets that threshold, which means that we come sort of close to it every single time, but it never quite gets vindicated. And so when we focus on harm, that's sort of where we go wrong. The second reason the law is simply not designed to handle privacy nicks is that the law focuses a lot on the concept of waiver. Privacy law in particular focuses on the concept of waiver. By waiver, I mean a conscious taking on of some sort of risk that manifests in privacy law in at least 3 different ways. The first way is through the third-party doctrine. So Some of my information privacy law students are here tonight. We haven't talked about it yet, but it's coming. There's this doctrine in Fourth Amendment law that says that if you give information to a third party, then, and this is where the third party goes, then you've waived any right to privacy. What do you think? It's not going to be a secret anymore. You've shared it with someone else. This is pretty persistent in the law of information privacy, and particularly Fourth Amendment doctrine, and it's a way in which we keep information that we share with others outside of the realm of protection. It also falls into this idea of no privacy in public. Evan and I have extensively written about the idea that there is a certain amount of privacy in public, even though the law tends to try to ignore it. And the way in which we live our lives is actually shrouded in zones of obscurity. So on your walk over here, you probably walked by, how many people? How many students did you imagine? Can you really remember meaningfully anything about most of them? Probably not. You certainly will forget by the time you go to eat dinner tonight. This is the way we live our lives, sort of shrouded in these zones of obscurity. But when you adopt a doctrine that says no privacy in public, you basically open it fair game for constant surveillance, for drone surveillance from above, from CCTV around every corner, for facial recognition technologies to identify you everywhere you go. The final and maybe most significant aspect of privacy law that fails us is the concept of consent, right? How could you be seen to have a privacy complaint when you consented to giving this personal information? How many of you click the I agree button without reading it? There are some that have raised their hands, and there are some that are liars. None of us should be required to read this, right? Like the idea that we could sort of meaningfully parse the level of risk from reading this turgid prose is silly. And yet the law sort of focuses on this idea that to one who consents, there is no wrong. Consent is like a legal magic, right? Where if you've consented, then we can do whatever you want to do. We can do whatever we want to do because you said it was okay. And so this idea of this sort of take it or leave it has really three major problems. One, consent is illusory, right? Like, oh, if only I could call up Google and be like, Google, I only want you to collect my geolocation on Wednesdays, but only in a sort of very specific way. And then as soon as I turn off this street, I don't want you to track me anymore, right? I don't want you to follow me after that street. Wouldn't it be great if we could just call up Google and tell them not to do that? But that's not real consent, right? I mean, that would be real control and sort of consent over our practices. Instead, what do? We get little I agree buttons, and we get check boxes, right? We get the decisions that they have designed for us to take, right? And so it's illusory, it's overwhelming, right? Think about how many requests for consent you get on a daily basis, right? I have now teenagers, but when my kids were younger, and maybe you did this when you were kids, you knew that the way you could get your parents to say yes to something is you just kept asking them, right? You're like, please, 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 please. And eventually they'd be like, fine, okay, you can have it, right? That's the way in which consent works. It works like a DDoS attack on our brains, right? Where we just get requests over and over until we finally relent. And so it's not meaningful consent. But most importantly, consent is myopic in the sense that it focuses only on my individual risk, right? The idea that I should be concerned about what's happening with me. And that leads me to the final way in which the law is fundamentally inadequate to address NICs, at least as it's currently configured, and that's because it focuses on proximity. It has this major self-oriented focus, right? So in a way, privacy law is super it encourages a sort of narcissism. When consent requests are about like what's going to happen to me, right? So when someone asks you for your personal information, you might run through your sort of mental calculus, like, all right, what's the worst that's going to happen to me here? Like, are you going to use it to deny me health insurance? Are you going to use this information in such a way that it's going to come back to bite me in employment in some scenario? Harm when you file a case for like a privacy tort. They're going to say, what happened to you? What's the injury to you, right? How are you somehow worse off? And what this ignores, of course, is the way in which our data and our information is used to power these systems so that they're used on other people, right? People that might have said no when they were asked, but now the machine is quite powerful, right? And it is difficult for them to say no. One of the biggest problems in our modern world when we base all of our privacy rules around consent and choice is it presumes that we have a choice to say no, that we're able to do so in the first place. Meanwhile, we're forced to use apps as a precondition for our employment or to get where we need to go. And so this focus on the self, I think, is really problematic. The other real problem is that it focuses on discrete actions. The idea that the unit of analysis that we're going to focus on is right here, right now, with you, between you and the Ring camera, right? So if we get spied on, or if someone, for example, uses a facial recognition app that is now commonly available, where I can just hold it up and I can identify everyone in this room, right? And I know all of your names and the first page of your Google search results and anything else that comes up. And the question that the law would then ask is, well, did that reveal anything harmful about you, right? Was that particular act of scanning your face harmful? But what it doesn't get is the accumulated harm that happens over time as we become accustomed to seeing our face scanned over and over, and slowly as our reasonable expectation of privacy is changed as a result of it. And finally, the law tends to look for immediate actions, right? So it looks for immediate cause and effect, where we want to see what was the thing that happened to you sort of within, I don't know, a relatively short time frame, right? Like, did someone use that information within 6 months to commit identity fraud, or were you somehow denied a piece of information? But what it doesn't collect is the ways in which data sort of has a way of working its way into the firmament, and then it combines with other pieces of data to produce new insights that are difficult to trace back to the original release of information, but yet are still used in these systems to make decisions about us. And so it's really hard to sort of track not only the collective footprint of this, but the sort of causal chain. And so as a result, because the law is obsessed with what's in it for you, right, and what wrong within this one particular context, it tends to basically excuse all sorts of privacy nicks, which in turn, we argue, normalize surveillance, right? So at this point, you might be saying, all right, Hartzog, maybe chill out a little bit. You seem a little upset on stage. If we get used to it, right, then what's the problem? Like, things change all the time. People used to faint when they got on trains for the first time, and now we think trains are pretty great. Even the bicycle, when it was first introduced, created a huge uproar, right? Like these are just technological panics, and they happen all the time. And so what about the people that actually think this is a good thing, that we should get used to these technologies because you're really just kind of overreacting? To that, I say, I'm not trying to impose my Luddite views on people here. Rather, I think that regardless of where you come down on individual decisions about whether, for example, facial recognition is justified, or whether the Ring doorbell is an intrusion upon our seclusion, I think there's plenty of reason why we should all worry about how the law ignores nicks. And here's what I mean by that. The fact that privacy nicks are so mundane actually acts to both distort and bypass our ability to critically reflect upon the danger of exposure. And so there's two normalization dynamics that Evan, Joanna, and I talk about in the paper, one of which is this idea of unacceptable habituation. The other one is this idea of favorably disposed normalization. Unacceptable habituation occurs when people, for example, in liberal Western democracies, take ubiquitously encountered surveillance systems for granted. We see them as so commonplace and mundane that we no longer talk about them critically. When was the last time you saw, for example, I don't know, a camera in an elevator that you took on the way up here and said, I don't like that, not a big fan of that, right? We've sort of completely accepted that CCTVs are in fact justified everywhere they're displayed. Now, maybe they are, but it's also possible that we've simply gotten used to them, right? They are unexceptionable because we've seen them so often and we can't complain about everything, so why would I complain about the thing that I've seen for the 10,000th time? Now, the other psychological dynamic is favorably disposed normalization. Here, the routine experience of being surveilled inclines people to view surveillance as acceptable, if not desirable, and it might influence what we believe is an appropriate privacy rule in response to it. One plausible psychological basis for favorably disposed normalization is the impact of believing that something is normal, right? There are lots of various explanations of this, but imagine for yourself trying to determine whether you think a practice is wrongful, right? If you conduct it, if you sort of encounter a particular practice by yourself, you might say, oh, I don't really like that. But if you're standing in line at Logan Airport, and there are 40 people ahead of you, and every single one of them walks through facial recognition without saying anything, and you get to it, how are we to sort of make sense of whether we think this is problematic? Now, some of us might pitch a fit, and I know many of my privacy-conscious friends routinely are like, I want to opt out. And then they get into a yelling match because sometimes they're like, we're not going to let you opt out. And you're like, I know I have the right to opt out. And it becomes a thing. But we might actually look around and say, well, everyone seems to think that this is okay, right? Like you look around and sort of we look around at what other people are doing, and we recognize, all right, well, this is probably fine. And if you encounter it again, and you encounter it again, then you might have the background assumption, someone's probably thought of this, and I guess it's okay, right? Now, maybe that doesn't account for all of our normalizing of surveillance, but it is something that if it happens, there's good reason to think that this is inhibiting our ability to critically reflect upon the surveillance practices that just sort of happen, right? They happen a little bit, and they happen a little more, and a little more, and at no point then, or at least we lose the ability over time to push back on it, right? And then once it's fully deployed, like CCTV cameras, we might say, well, that's the ballgame, right? We're basically used to it at this point. And what I worry about that is a constantly eroding expectation of privacy. Again, in privacy law, I teach information privacy law at BU. One of the first things you learn is that it basically all comes down to what is a reasonable expectation of privacy. What is that? Well, there are normative components to it, but it turns out that in practice it's largely descriptive. What do people expect when they go out into the world? By failing to recognize NICs, the law allows society to constantly renegotiate expectations of privacy without the protection of a firm backstop. When NICs proliferate unchecked, the NIC and the CHOP then work together to create a vicious inevitability cycle. Companies that want to profit by engaging in all sorts of corrosive behavior regarding surveillance use the fact that we've been normalized to a certain degree of a loss of obscurity due to the sort of death from 1,000 cuts to engage in what we would call a CHOP, right? So they get sort of brave, they get emboldened, they introduce AR glasses that implement facial recognition overall, and they're counting on the fact that we've sort of become used to this sort of surveillance in other areas. And so that which would have been challenged 15 years ago, and if you had introduced facial recognition technology 15 years ago, it probably would have freaked everyone out, right? Even though I know it's been around for a long time, but it's only sort of in the past few years really come into common practice. Now, they've just gotten away with a CHOP, and that reset our expectation of value just a little bit lower, right? It conditions us to accept just a little bit more exposure every single time. And so that constantly then goes, the cycle then continues. And so by ignoring privacy NICs, the law facilitates an inevitability cycle of increasingly invasive surveillance. The line only goes down for our privacy, and it only goes up for how much we're being watched. And what the real reason I think we should be concerned about this is what Evan and I'll call a loss of power death spiral. So it doesn't, normalized surveillance doesn't just disempower people through negative consequences, though it can have that effect. The more we are exposed, the less capacity we have for things like democratic resistance. A death spiral is a period of continuous deterioration that leads ultimately to catastrophic failure or destruction. If lawmakers and judges continue to ignore privacy nicks, they risk a death spiral for democratic resistance and countermeasures to surveillance because there is no backstop. Society becomes increasingly exposed past the point where meaningful and peaceful resistance becomes possible because we are watched everywhere we go and everything we do, which, if you buy the privacy theorists that say that it becomes hard to exercise political power when there's a camera in your face all the time, then we lose the ability to push back and to demand democratic accountability, perhaps forever. So, all right, at this point, maybe I've convinced you that normalizing surveillance is a bad thing, even if there are certain decisions that we might come down differently on regarding the use of surveillance. So maybe you say, all right, smart guy, how does the law respond to this? Well, I can tell you what's not going to work, and that's self-help, right? There are all sorts of remedies that will be touted to you for the next 20 to 30 years, as far as I can tell, about how to protect your own privacy. The number one question that I get after every talk that I give is, what can I do to protect my own privacy? And the answer is, unfortunately, nothing. That's not true. I take it back. You can vote, right? You can get into demanding democratic accountability, but what you can't do is fight the most powerful organizations the world has ever known with privacy settings and I agree buttons, right? Control over personal information is just a story that you're told to continue making self-interested decisions that slowly normalize surveillance practices over time. So that's not going to work. Instead, we argue, Evan, Joanna, and I argue, there are three things that you can do, that the lawmakers could do to really meaningfully take account of privacy nicks. The first is focusing on collectives. So it's easy to think about privacy as an individual endeavor, right? My privacy, I don't want someone spying on me, because we feel those things most acutely. And the law has responded like that, and it's basically given us all the remedies that are individually focused. But instead, lawmakers should think about collective well-being. So when they're creating rules for what constitutes a meaningful privacy impact for assessment, let's not ask what happens to individuals, but on collective and vulnerable groups, right? Let's push away from consent requirements and move towards collective obligations to watch out for people's well-being, prioritizing the most vulnerable among us first, and then working outward, right? Within these relationships that we are in, these protective relationships. I've argued with another scholar, Neil Richards, for imposing robust duties of loyalty that would require companies to act in our best interests and protect people no matter what they choose, no matter what I agree button they click on, no matter what they have their privacy settings on. We would have an affirmative obligation that looked out for collectives rather than individuals. And the most important thing that we need to do is chuck the reasonable expectations of privacy test as part of this, because it is, if it ever was useful, privacy has become such a amorphous concept and such an easily co-opted concept that if you fail to define it any further, it ceases to be very useful. And so we need to move away from expectations. The next thing I want us to focus on is, instead of focusing on rules that prohibit you from doing one thing or another, let's focus on design. Let's take design seriously and think about having rules that basically take certain sorts of design practices. And here I'm thinking about dark patterns that are user interfaces made to trick you into waiving your privacy interests. Let's take that seriously and impose a rule against dark patterns, perhaps by emboldening the Federal Trade Commission to police not just unfair trade practices or deceptive trade practices, but abusive trade practices, those that leverage our own limitations against us and act as a betrayal. We could have specific rules around the use of biometrics. We could have specific rules that prohibit things like not just spyware, but information technologies that are designed to be undetectable, right? Spy cameras that are built in particular ways to hide their appearance, right? We know that that is a design choice to make surreptitious spying easier. And on balance, we're probably worse off because of it. Are there benefits to this? Sure, but the law has to start making some hard decisions about the design of information technologies in order to, I think, meaningfully account for privacy nicks. And then finally, we need to start thinking about outright prohibitions. And this is the part that the law has been relatively reluctant to embrace. But I argue, and Evan and I have argued in the past, that its time has come. Procedural rules, those that require impact assessments or a certain sort of process, end up justifying the practices that they seek to curb. What is needed are substantive prohibitions for dangerous activities that no amount of procedure can justify. This might be modeled on Title III's prohibition on spyware, which outright prohibits the trafficking in spyware. Or it might be modeled on the American Data Privacy and Protections Act's prohibition on practices seen as disloyal and an absolute prohibition on things like cross-contextual behavioral advertising. It might prohibit the use of facial recognition in public places, or it might prohibit the use of facial recognition outright. What we need are strong, bright-line prohibitions that will simply provide a substantive backstop that no amount of normalization will be able to justify. It will protect us no matter how acclimated we become. So while these prohibitions are more politically fraught, they are also a little more admittedly inflexible. They are exactly what is needed if we are going to take the normalization of surveillance seriously. It might sound extreme to call for an outright ban on the most dangerous surveillance practices, even though they have some utility, but we think it's absolutely necessary. So, in conclusion, the stakes are high. Over time, the slippery slope of normalizing surveillance stands to change fundamental social beliefs about privacy. The endpoint of the slope is the wide-scale degradation of privacy protections necessary for pursuing the good life and maintaining the full potential of a liberal democracy. One of the most problematic aspects of a society becoming acclimated to privacy nicks is that we become unable to fully appreciate how our autonomy, and by respect, our dignity, is being routinely violated. We become programmed not to worry about forms of surveillance that once struck many of us as creepy, perhaps an ambiguous threat. Over time, these privacy diminutions are seen as worrisome, fail to trigger even the most basic concern. Lawmakers must not allow society to grow ever more alienated from appreciating the goods that privacy offers without engaging in the oversight required to protect our fundamental liberties. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about the case against normalizing surveillance, and I really look forward to your questions.